So emotional potty training is the metaphor that I've used to describe kind of the practice of healing ourselves. It's the metaphor that I think is the most useful and immediately illuminating around how to deal with your emotions is if you look at how to deal with your poop. For instance, like this morning, let's say, we're talking in the morning on the West Coast, we both most likely had a signal in our bodies that said, hey, it's time, go to the bathroom and do the one thing that you've known your entire life because we were potty trained. The one thing that will get rid of that cramping signal that says it's time to go to the bathroom. Emotions, what are they? Well, they are intense clusters of physical sensation that move through the body when allowed. Like if you take off the letter E, what you have left is motion. And so they're almost identical in a way to this like physical cascade of feeling that lets you know that something real has to be moved through the body. Now, most of us didn't have parents who understood that, or who were comfortable with allowing their own emotions. Yeah, well, what I think is that most people at this point have chosen a few, maybe a couple, maybe many drugs of choice where they are soothing and medicating their own discomfort, their own anxiety, their harder emotions because they didn't receive these tools. And as far as like the context in which we're doing that, I mean, there are huge corporations, people, entities that profit off of us doing that. Like the entertainment industry, the beauty industry, the clothing industry. Like if we all knew that that buying a new sweater isn't actually going to help us love ourselves, it will give us a very temporary hit of relief that's medicating maybe our discomfort with politics, our discomfort with the state of the world, our anxiety about our capacity to take care of ourselves or support ourselves financially. If we all knew that doesn't really work, but what does work is feeling our feelings, stress, anxiety, fear, is to practice that vulnerable, I'm so scared. I'm scared right now. And to try to tune into, okay, how is that fear showing up in my body? Do I want to run and freak out? Am I really shaky and jittery? Do I feel trembling and high energy, high frequency? Or do I feel stuck in bed, can't move, totally paralyzed? And then depending on what energetic place you start in, you would want to support that. Because remember, I said it's all about allowing this thing to move through you. So if you're feeling that jittery, oh my God, what am I going to do? Is the world going to fall apart? You might turn on a weird song, and jump and shake and kind of do some frenetic movements where you're actually just giving yourself permission. I'm scared. I'm allowed to be scared. Of course I'm scared. These are really helpful sentences. And then you just try to meet the energy and shake. And, you might take a run where you're actually trying to feel how scared you are in that way.
Welcome to your journey to find true tranquility with the Tranquility Magazine podcast with your host, Jasmine Maya Royce. Today's episode featuring, you can find more information about tranquility on our website, tranquilitymagazine.com.
Today, I have the honor of interviewing Rachel Kaplan. She is an MA, MFT, is a licensed psychotherapist with a thriving practice in the San Francisco Bay Area, a creator and host of acclaimed podcast, Feeling, Healing, Shit Show. She is active on a variety of social media channels. Kaplan has studied yoga, meditation, and hands-on healing practices in India and Nepal, earning a master's degree in counseling psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies, and trained in a cutting-edge trauma modification such as MDR. Her new book, Feel, Heal, and Let That Shit Go, Your Guide to Emotional Resilience and Lasting Self-Love, is out, and I am so excited to have you here today. Rachel, thank you very much for coming.
Having me.
Yeah, so your first question is always, what is your current mantra or state of mind?
Well, in general, I feel like I'm coming off of a huge peak as far as career and focus and work speed. So I'm just remembering there's only one way off the mountain, and it's down. And just like letting my system unwind and letting myself slow down and letting myself be with some of the feelings that come with like coming down.
Mm-hmm.
Very much like in the moment, the last few weeks, what I'm working with.
I think it's true. Like you get a high sometimes with experiences in life that you've been planning and plotting towards, and you finally have the achievement of the, key to the city, so to speak. And then you end up like the adrenaline drops and you have to like process the fact that it goes into that quiet, even the season changing and all those extra elements kind of add to that process.
Absolutely. And trusting that we can't actually stay at the peak. It's not sustainable without getting all out of balance. So, and that was very clear in this buildup. Like I need to slow down. And now I'm practicing slowing down.
So you have a plethora of certifications and explorations in your career. So how did that evolve for you in your trauma and take you that direction? And what way did you go first?
Well, it might sound like there's a lot there, and I certainly have done a lot of training. I would say that this has been a lifelong pursuit of studying healing. What happened for me is my first huge attachment outside my family of origin, because of course we have attachment to our family, but was my first love. And when we were both 14, he took his life. And so that was annihilating, devastating. And by 16, I realized I really needed help, that I was in a relationship almost by accident, realized that when this person wasn't around me, I pretended they were dead. Not pretended, like I couldn't sustain connection. It was just such a profound trauma. And so I started therapy, and it was a humbling journey in that by 18, I thought I had kind of arrived. And by the time I was in studying East Asian healing traditions like yoga, meditation, etc., I was kind of deluded where I was. I had had a huge first layer of healing from this experience, but it would really be the next 25 years of working the layers of my own, inner healing. And, everything I've been doing recently, as far as like the podcast, the book, all of the psychoeducation is really coming from what did I realize? It was after 25 years of healing myself. So age 37, that was the moment. It actually happened in Joshua Tree. We both talked about how we have an affinity for Joshua Tree. I have a home there, probably because of this experience. But I was 37 by myself on a mountain in this beautiful park and had an experience that essentially showed me that I finally loved myself. Like actually didn't have resistance to myself, just felt really well. And I had spent a year, the year prior, I had left a marriage about a year before. And I had spent a year actually on international musical tour and a lot of time by myself. And I was just shocked during this time of like meeting myself, like, wow, I really feel well. I really feel worthy. I really feel lovable and joyful. And, it kind of culminated in this moment at the end of the year in Joshua Tree. And from that place, everything that I've been offering, has been based in the desire to show the difference. Like what made the difference? Because I was already a psychotherapist doing one-on-one work with people, quite good at it for a decade by that point. And what I realized from my work as a therapist, both from being in the field, but also working with hundreds of people, is that most people don't get to the place I was experiencing in myself. I never thought I would. And I don't think most people do. And I don't think the therapeutic industry necessarily gets people to that place where they actually love themselves and feel well. And so I've kind of become obsessed with like sharing the specific tools that help people do that. And, as far as like your initial question of just, how did I do what? It's like, for me, like the biggest influences on me were not necessarily therapeutic. Like during the marriage that wasn't viable that I left, that kind of set the stage for my realizing who I was getting really profound work with someone who wasn't in the therapeutic world at all. He was like a ascetic living in a mud hut in the Southwest desert, like it was amazing. He had a phone. But I have done all of the traditional kind of Western therapeutic trainings, or not all of them, but quite a few. And I also have this background in Eastern. But for me, the question is really like, what actually works? And so what I'm offering now is what I have found is actually essential and works.
Yeah, it's important to kind of reflect on your own inner journey for everyone. You've been in this for a long period of time, but you were speaking about what I call a proverbial wake-up call. Sometimes at
Mm.
37 different ages, some massive transition leaves you kind of processing your inner work and your experience. When you think you knew, you realize that for most of us, we know nothing. So we start a different kind of journey and a different exploration. And you found, like, what I would say, a proverbial hermit guru in a
Yeah,
way.
years prior, I think
Yeah.
like the hermit guru is what led to the realization I love myself. But I would say
Mhm.
the 37 moment wasn't the wake up call. It was the, oh my God, I'm here. I'm here in this way
Mhm.
I've been working for my whole life, which doesn't mean I'm not a human and don't struggle and don't have hard feelings, but just that like I'm drawing from a baseline of wellness and
Mhm.
worth and stability that I never thought I'd have. And I think is really helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree that you have to have that moment when you have found your path and you're enjoying it, and how to give that or teach that to other people in their elements. So I wanted you to discuss what your viewpoint and how you created emotional potty training and what that is for you.
Yeah. So emotional body training is the metaphor that I've used to describe kind of the practice of healing ourselves. It's the metaphor that I think is the most useful and immediately illuminating around how to deal with your emotions is if you look at how to deal with your poop. For
Mhm.
instance, like this morning, let's say, what
Mhm.
we're talking at in the morning on the West
Mhm.
Coast, we both most likely had a signal in our bodies that said, hey, it's time, go to the bathroom and do the one thing that you've known your entire life because we were potty trained. The one thing that will get rid of that cramping signal that says it's time to go to the bathroom. We go to the bathroom, we leave a poop. We
Mhm.
say that we take a poop, but we actually leave it, right?
Mhm.
And then we wash up. I mean, we might not invite our friends in. We might not like make videos from there. It's a fairly private experience.
Mhm.
But we don't, when we get that signal, we're not like, oh, should I buy something? Should I check my Tinder matches? Right? We know that there's only one thing that's going to not have us have that feeling. And it's actually allowing what's trying to move through us that we're feeling, that we're sensing to move through us. And, emotions, what are they? Well, they are intense clusters of physical sensation that move through the body when allowed. Like if you take off the letter E, what you have left is motion. And so they're almost identical in a way to
Mhm.
this like physical cascade of feeling that lets you know that something real has to be moved through the body. Now, most of us didn't have parents who understood that, or who were comfortable with allowing their own emotions. It's changing a little bit these days. We're living in a time where people are more, open to and in favor of feeling your feelings. But for
Mhm.
most people listening to podcasts like this or, reading self-help therapy books, they probably have decades of feelings that instead of just allowing to move through them, allowing to do their thing, they most likely avoided, shoved down, medicated. And there's a lot I could say about that. I mean, as tiny little vulnerable babies, we need connection to our parents to survive. And we're animals, so we know that. So if every time you cry for a long time, your mom gets
Mhm.
distant and glassy eyed, you're incentivized to not do that. And that's like best case scenario. Like some
Mhm.
parents will be like, you're safe. There's nothing to be afraid of. Shh, you're okay. These are all really loving gestures from caregivers that will quiet feelings, right? So even best case scenario, most of us are like, I shouldn't feel too much. And
Mhm.
of course, now we live in an economy that's realizing that instead of feeling insecure, they can sell us facial products or clothing or self-help courses or,
Mhm.
entertainment movies. So most people are living unaware of how to support and allow their emotions to move through them. They mostly have decades of backlogged emotional shit that has not been processed. And so, if basically what I'm doing in my work is teaching people how do you like bring your system back into balance so that you can have a feeling when you need to? How do you find the parts of you that you cast out in order to keep your caregivers close that have so much of that unfelt pain? How
Mhm.
do you bring them back into your awareness where you can actually start to care for them? And then how do you help them clear out their emotional shit so you can come into present time as you are and like handle being a human at this time? Because we know there are hard feelings. There's just no way around that.
Yeah, no, it's very true that there's a lot of things to process, so to speak. And you're using a term that I've been working on personally. I call it my emotional cleanse. When I go to the bathroom, I'm like, I'm processing everything that I need to go let go of right now. And you put it in
Absolutely.
great terminology. I was like, oh, she hit it on the head. That basically emotional pooping, is an experience that mostly I'm talking to my body and having a connection to feel like how the body is doing more than my mental too, because both things are linked. But you have expanded a little bit when you were talking about what you termed as the cultural shit show. So dig deeper into that and explain some of the nuances of what we're dealing with as a social creatures in this timeline that we're kind of denying that work.
Yeah, well, what I think is that most people at this point have chosen a few, maybe a couple, maybe many drugs of choice where they are soothing and medicating their own discomfort, their own, anxiety, their harder emotions because they didn't receive these tools. And as far as like the context in which we're doing that, I mean, there are huge corporations, people, entities that profit off of us doing that. Like the entertainment industry, the beauty industry, the clothing industry. Like if we all knew that that buying a new sweater isn't actually going to help us love ourselves, it will give us a very temporary hit of relief that's medicating, maybe our discomfort with politics, our discomfort with the state of the world, our anxiety about our capacity to take care of ourselves or support ourselves financially. If we all knew that doesn't really work, but what does work is feeling our feelings for, short bouts of time in skillful ways, we would spend a little less money, right? We would be a little less distracted. We would feel a little more empowered. And so what I'm saying is that because we didn't get the early training and because we needed to survive in families with humans and humans are all flawed, we were kind of invested in and putting parts of ourselves in hiding. And that creates a certain level of distress that, if you're trying to avoid yourself and your pain, you can't really be in yourself. And so it starts this journey of needing to find more and more ways to check out and to numb out. And none of them work. I think they usually lead to, I think, kind of similar to what you just referenced, this wake up moment where maybe you've been chasing success your whole life and you reach the pinnacle of success and you still feel bad. Or maybe you thought you'd feel worthy and lovable once you were married and then you get married and you still feel bad. Like there are these moments, or just, crippling addiction or crippling depression that can wake us up to the thing we're trying to do to deal with our human emotional experience isn't working. And then you have a chance to turn toward it. But it's not necessarily good for the powers that be that we do that. And, there's just endless distraction at our fingertips.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's very true that you were talking about over consumerism here in this country specifically. It was hard for me when I moved back to the States to realize how much of a support mechanism, so to speak, that became for people, and how much, and also social media that you touched on, how people were emoting with everybody else's experiences and feeling lesser than, and they were so immersed in a phone that you wouldn't have a conversation with them anymore. Right. You were just there having their own dialogue with their phone for entertainment purposes, or looking outside themselves because they feel like everybody else's life is so much better than theirs.
That they have to prove that their life's so great, and which can create a sense of imposter. If you're being like, I'm perfect, I'm smart, everything's persona. Great.
Yeah, I mean, that's because that's the shiniest version of you and the best of you. And I'm having a great day all day long when emotionally you're not really digging into anything that's authentic and true, or meaning that you don't think anyone else would support you or validate you if you feel like you're going that direction on a social media platform, so to speak. So you didn't have that. It's convoluted and lost interpretation and a misleading practice that is full of every one of us trying to keep up with the Joneses on a social media platform, which is a hard one. But you delve into the idea of something that I think is a calling card for some people, fear. And how are people supposed to process, explore, or even endeavor in that aspect?
Yeah. Well, what I like fear, starting with talking about fear is kind of like, I would say it's like the third step. So let me back up a little bit. I promise you I will get to that. But let me say first, so to deal with fear or any emotion, it's really about how do you get in touch with the physical experience that's happening and support it happening, support it flowing. And emotions are energetic and they have essentially two main patterns. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's like an explosive outward energy, which you'll see in a version of fear, like frenetic fear, like
Mm-hmm.
fight, flight. It's like,
Yes.
gotta get away. If,
Mm-hmm.
like even like someone swerves into your lane on the highway, your
Mm.
blood might rush to your limbs. I notice like I'll get like swollen forearms when I have a scary
Mm.
moment driving. It's like if you're angry, it's an explosive energy. You want to like your heat rises, you might have bald fists, right? So there's that energetic.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other energetic is a downward collapsing energetic. And you see that mostly with sadness,
Mm-hmm.
grief, despair. And there's a downward collapsing version of fear as well, like freeze. If people who are in paralysis, they're so scared, or
Mm.
they're collapsed in fear. And the final emotion that really like most of the healing journeys lead to for most of us, what's deep at the
Mm.
core of our wound is shame.
Mm.
It's a sense of, am I okay? Am I enough? And shame, usually when people experience it in its rawest form, is going to be that downward energy of like, nobody loves me. It's like a really painful, tender, maybe you'd cry. But there's shame. So basically, anger, unilateral, going one direction, it's explosive. Sadness, going one direction, it's implosive. Fear goes two ways, okay? And shame is mostly one way, but to fight back, to overcome shame, you kind of have to fight back. You have to do something more explosive eventually in your journey. So to go back to your question, now that we have some of the basics in place, fear, first of all, most people who are experiencing chronic fear are going to call it anxiety or
Mm-hmm.
stress. And these are these socially acceptable ways that we start talking to each other. It's very rare, less so these days, thank God, that like people just say, I'm so scared.
Mm.
Often it's like, oh my God, I'm so stressed about this. I'm so worried. And I think one of the tools to use in trying to get closer to your feelings, AKA have them, AKA release them, is
Mhm.
using really simple language. So the first thing you can do if you think you struggle with stress, anxiety, fear is to practice that vulnerable, I'm so scared. I'm
Mhm.
scared right now. And to try to tune into, okay, how is that fear showing up in my body? Do I want to run and freak out? Am I really shaky and jittery? Do
Mhm.
I feel trembling and high energy, high frequency? Or do I feel stuck in bed, can't move,
Mm.
totally paralyzed? And then depending on what energetic place you start in, you would want to support that. Because remember, I said it's all about allowing this thing to move through you. So if
Mhm.
you're feeling that jittery, oh my God, what am I going to do? Is the world
Mhm.
going to fall apart? You might turn on a weird song, like, and jump and shake and kind of do some frenetic movements where you're actually just giving yourself permission. I'm scared. I'm allowed to be scared. Of course, I'm scared. These are really helpful sentences.
Mhm.
And then you just try to like meet the energy and shake. And,
Mhm.
you might take a run where you're like actually trying to feel how scared you are in that way. If you felt the other way, if you felt like, oh my God, I just want to hide under a rock, I'm so terrified, I feel helpless and alone, maybe you want to get in your bed or under a weighted blanket or in a bathtub if you have one.
Mhm.
And so you create a feeling of containment and being swaddled. And then you're going to try to slow down with more of that implosive energy and see if you can't cry. And
Mhm.
like, as if you were, supporting like a scared child or your scared pet, right?
Mhm.
And there are a lot of skills in the book. Before I get into the details of each emotion, there's a whole bunch of generic skills that will help people learn how do you even just bring your awareness from the outer world where we're constantly distracted
Mhm.
into the body where you can start to track what is actually happening. How am I really? And, and there are also skills around how do you get over the judgment toward your feelings, right? So
Mhm.
it's about like, how do you bring your awareness in? Then how do you get curious and not tell yourself you shouldn't be as you are? And there are certain techniques sometimes people need to use where you have to pretend it's someone else having the feeling. Like,
Mhm.
what would I do if it was my niece who was this scared? How would I show up? How would I talk to her? Okay, let me try talking to myself that way. Most of us talk to ourselves in really harsh ways, right? And so
Mhm.
there's this reprogramming. Eventually, if you want to let any pain go, you have to realize the part of you that's scared is you.
Mhm.
We can get into that later because I think it's one of the biggest pitfalls in the therapeutic self-help mindset industry is the constant desire to not actually become the pain or identify with the pain. I've actually found that to actually release something, you
Mhm.
do have to get to the place where you're able to connect to it as your own
Mhm.
truth. Like, I am scared. Oh
Yeah.
no, everything might fall apart, because that's the part that needs the support. If we're just constantly saying there's nothing to be afraid of, we're
Mhm.
dismissing ourselves the way we've been dismissed most of our life. So what I want you to know, first of all, anyone listening, you might be like, wow, this is complex. And I just thought she was going to be like, you should take more walks. But like the book that I've written and my podcast, season 1, and most of what I'm doing is going to lay out and break down these steps in ways that make it really basic and practical and practicable
Mhm.
so that you can just get in there and find out what works for you when you're scared. The last thing I'll say about fear is that it's really uncomfortable to work with. I think it may be one of the hardest feelings. I mean, shame is
Mhm.
probably the most painful. Being able to feel just directly that we don't know if we're good enough or lovable, that
Mhm.
really burns. That's like a painful shit.
Yeah.
That's like you had too much spicy food kind of movement of feelings. But fear is really scary. It's like that
Mhm.
sounds like an obvious statement. So sometimes before people do fear work, let's say if you were going to try to let yourself move your fear, you have to say to yourself, okay, I know I have a roof over my head. I have people who love me. I'm going to be okay. And now I'm going to feel how much I'm terrified that I won't be okay. So it's almost like if you were rock climbing or you were going down into a cave, the way you would hook into something safe. Like you would do what I call reality testing,
Mhm.
which is another thing we could talk about because people kind of like, that's like the same thing of people trying to talk themselves out of your feelings. Generally, I suggest it at the end of a feeling, not before a feeling or during a feeling. But
Okay.
sometimes with fear, we have to be like, okay, I know I'm actually safe as far as I can tell, you know?
Mhm.
And now I'm going to let myself feel how unsafe I feel. And
Mm.
then at the end, you'd also go back to, okay, I know it felt like I'm about to lose everything. Is that actually true? Where you'd go back to trying to scaffold. Is there a basic sense of safety that you can rest in?
Yeah. I mean, it's important to understand. We're going to touch on, you were saying, like, you called it bringing your emotions online, so to speak. But in going back to the idea of fear, why I think that's a realm that people eventually need to explore a little bit more, because some of my viewpoint, I see to myself, if emotion is like colliding with fear, there's something there that I need to explore. Like, and setting the groundwork that you're talking about to make sure people don't feel scared, intimidated, or any emotional safety blanket to help them process those emotions is more important to be prepared for what they're going to bring up.
Yeah.
And yes, talking about your bringing your emotions online is part of what you're speaking about, and how it's beneficial to kind of recalibrate to get in self and figure out what our emotions are. And you touched on before, when you push it all down, processing too much too soon may be catalyst of an alternative rather than a benefit.
Yeah. I'm curious what you mean by when you say processing too much too soon.
I meant if someone is recently just starting out the process of doing
Yeah.
emotional healing and
Right.
they haven't really explored different areas and they're very new to the idea, then having not a safety blanket or other people,
Right.
a counselor, support, or an alternative to kind of handhold or support you for that journey, it can be harder. You mentioned about PTSD, other elements that are important for people to be aware of that you may need to someone else to be there with
Yeah.
and for you.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting with that is most people are afraid that if they start to have their feelings, they will be flooded and they'll never get out of it. And there are occasionally people where, due to the way their system is wired, they can get into deeply overwhelming, over emotional states. For the most part, though, the vast majority of people are going to have the other problem, which is they decide they want to try to feel and they can't actually feel. They're more numb than hyper emotional. And it can be really frustrating, because if you've decided you hear this podcast, you're like, I want to feel my feelings. I know that will help me, like most people are actually going to struggle with access. And I agree that like when you're starting, and especially because so much of what brings people to the path of trying to heal themselves is this big turbulent life stuff where life kind of squeezes you so much that feelings just start squirting out of you like a tube of toothpaste. Like, that, and there's different types of feeling. There's like reactive emotional release work, which is more like that. Like something happens to you during your day, your feelings are kicked up and you have access to them. And your work in that way, in my opinion, is to learn how to move it appropriately. So you're not going to unleash on someone. You're not going to become violent or abusive with someone. And we do the same thing when we have to poop. If we got a sudden urge that we have to poop, we don't just poop wherever we are. We get to a place where it's, most likely like
safe or something like that.
Occasionally you can't make it there. And actually every episode of my podcast has a poop story from someone who wasn't able to get there, or some version of that. So there's a way to do, feeling our feelings appropriately, even when life is happening to us, which is going to be more those moments like you're referencing where someone needs more hand holding or needs more help. The deeper part of the work that is a lot harder for people, and usually the skills for this come on slower than just learning to feel the feelings that are already kicked up in you, is how do you actually go into the parts of you that have been repressed or taken offline, like you said, and bring them back. And that requires more of a practice like you would set up if you were going to the gym or if you were trying to learn to meditate or learn yoga. It's like you actually have to like create a time and space for it and do this practice of bringing your awareness in. And for most people with that, they're not going to be overwhelmed immediately because you're trying to like pull up this thing that's been buried and doesn't trust you yet. Actually, those parts of us that we've been cheating on and casting out, we have to rebuild their trust. So yeah. And it is helpful to work with someone if they know how to do this. Some therapists don't.
True. I mean, therapists, I always say it's like finding a good relationship. You can be picky. You can figure out who really gets you, understands you, and has some emotional capacity to understand what you're processing and what you're experiencing in their own journey too, to match it.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work for you, you can always try someone else. But people get intimidated by the idea of finding someone in that practice. They don't even know where to start, which is harder to kind of like, I'm going to show me to this person that I don't even know about. And I just have to expose all my parts to that and not feel judged. So it's harder vulnerable for people to be vulnerable on some like in their mind random person. But you're right in like yoga is a great example of doing yoga with a great instructor. You breathe through it and it makes you cry or have an experience because they give you a modality like a thought process. And in that experience, it will bring up some of those emotions. We're lucky that we're women, that we're most part very emotional creatures. And like we can talk about it more freely
and conditioned to be like given permission,
but not always the case. And also now it's a plethora of different versions and types that everyone has a different cue set for their emotional balance if it's open or closed. And in that you kind of touch on an experience about defining your emotions. You had a therapist that you had before and she gave you mentioned a couple of the words, rewording your phrasing and how.
Yeah, my first therapist that I started seeing after the suicide basically helped me from being a little tiny talking head that was using very like nuanced language and doing all of that instead of feeling. She
Mm-hmm.
said to me, and I use different words than she does, but she said, you have four choices if I ask you how you feel. You can be glad, mad, sad, or scared.
Mm-hmm.
And if you break it down to make it that simple, it's very hard to avoid it. It's very hard to intellectualize. And so that is a very useful tip. I kind of referenced it when I said, instead of saying stressed or worried or anxious,
Yeah.
let's call it scared. Let's call it the simplest version so that we can't escape it. If you're writing poetry, if you're writing something, that you want to be really nuanced, sure, use, those magnets where there's like, how do you feel? And there's 30 options, really useful. If you're trying to feel your feelings, which is probably the best thing you could do with them, as far as for the purpose of healing, not for the purpose of making art or communicating in a nuanced way, but for the purpose of healing, the simpler, the better. Because like the simpler, the more likely you're going to drop in below your head and actually have the experience, which is going to enable it to cascade through you and leave you.
Yeah. Like expunge it or poop it out, so to speak, in your narrative. So exploring a little bit more on after the practice kind of starts in your viewpoint of your book, you have a context of your superpower dashboard. You want to explore a little bit about what your tricks and ideas and verbiage for this means?
Sure. That is like, I referenced it in that I said, before you get into the specific feelings, you have to learn these basic skills of bringing your awareness inside. So these are things like awareness, the term awareness. It's like noticing, what am I paying attention to? Am I listening to sounds? Am I noticing smells? Or, it's like we can either follow our sense doors or our thoughts or our sensations. These are the things that our awareness will be based in, either external or internal. So like awareness is the first superpower. And then it's curiosity. How do you get curious about bringing your awareness inside and being like, what's happening in my body? Specifically, most usefully between your chin and your crotch. That's where a lot of the sensations and feelings are, sometimes in the face. And so how do you bring that awareness in this non-judgmental, curious way inside? And then there's a whole practice of, actually asking, how do I feel? And noticing, is it about, noticing in the beginning, the basic tone, am I frenetic or am I collapsed? Do I feel calm? Do I feel energetic? And then starting to track, what are the sensations in the body of that? How do I know? Where do I have clusters of sensation of pain or emotion in the body? The basic skills on the super board or the dashboard of superpowers, which was I was just trying to gamify it. It's like, you have this system that is giving you feedback. And if you can learn to pay attention and read the dashboard of your emotional, physical state, you get all this information about how you are. And then there are these more advanced skills that I referenced also when I was talking about sometimes you need to talk to yourself as if you're someone else. So, once you have the awareness of what's happening, maybe there's like a heaviness in your heart, you feel heartbroken, you feel, sad. Okay, you notice that. So now you might want to say, well, you converse with that part. Hey, little one, what do you need? What's happening? Like what? And that might help you feel more open, more loving toward it. And then the final one and the most critical one is the step I call becoming. And that's really about being able to allow yourself to realize that pain in you is you. It's like you're the one that's heartbroken, right? In this moment. And like, can you actually try to let yourself sink into the sensation from the point of view of the part that's in pain? And that's where ideally the peak of an emotional release would happen, where you're like, maybe it's, you just got broken up with, or you don't know if you'll ever be loved, or you got hit with insecurity and comparison. And so now you're like feeling like really ashamed of yourself and it makes you heartbroken. And so instead of being like, using your mantras and saying, no, you're good enough. You're actually, you get brave enough to actually be like, fall into that pain of like, yeah, maybe I'm not good enough. And what I find is that is the most important step. And I think it's the difference between people who are hobbling around talking to themselves about their wounding and their healing and trying to pump themselves up. And the people who actually feel okay, like to actually feel okay, you have to feel the part of you that doesn't feel okay. If you haven't included that part in, if it's still being pushed away because you're too scared to admit some part of you is insecure or doesn't love yourself, then you're going to feel fragmented and you're going to have to compensate. When you learn that even the part of you that doesn't know if it's enough is lovable and you love it, you allow it, you hold it and cry from that place and let it move, you're going to start to realize, wow, even the things that I think are the worst things about me are lovable. I can be here. And that's where like a more genuine kind of self-acceptance can start. And so I think that piece of being brave enough and knowing how to actually embody the pain and identify with the pain momentarily, not forever, not all day long, but in these proactive sessions is game changing.
Yeah, it's very important to understand. You're talking about, your awareness of your body, big read. You can figure out what your gut is doing to kind of process how you're feeling if you are more open to those ideas and more in touch of yourself. Going back to the validation of knowing your actual self, like being okay with you, knowing you're okay. We all have flaws, imperfections, all kinds of things that are making us. You use a quote that I love by Oscar Wilde, who I am immensely fan just because of his history and his experience. What was it? Be the only authentic you, because everyone else is taken. Yeah. So
be yourself. Everyone else is taken.
Yeah. And it's a great idea to fully embrace who you are and feel okay with you. But you're also talking about some elements of when you do childhood experiences and talking to your inner childhood self is what you're referencing sometimes when you're saying like, I'm okay, you're okay, I'll support you, speaking your inner dialogue to yourself as a child. And you do touch on that in the book about big T, little t's and the difference and a little bit of a different verbiage. Do you want to expand about your choice words in that department? Because most therapists.
Yeah, there's a couple things that are getting blended right now. One is like, the inner child healing. How do we heal our inner children? And how does working with yourself or this concept of a young you come into healing? And I do think it's actually like that wing is the preliminary wing. If you want to have your feelings, you're not going to unless you have a connection and you have awareness or access to the parts of you that were in so much pain that kind of shut down or numbed, right? And so for most of us to bring those parts back online, it does involve looking at our childhood self, like considering what did we think made our parents upset with us? What did we feel was unacceptable about us at school or at home? So that we can know what might I be hiding from the world and from myself. And then we can start to court those little parts back online. I suggest like putting a picture of yourself as a child on a home screen or making a little altar where you have a few pictures of yourself at ages where you didn't feel acceptable, where you didn't feel lovable. So you're reminded, how's little Rachy? How's little Jazzy? And so you can start to like include them in your life. See, what do they actually like? Who do they actually feel safe with? What do they actually need? And I do think in the proactive emotional release work, like sometimes something will happen to us reactively where suddenly we feel like, like I had an experience with a client yesterday where it's a dynamic about us figuring out if we're going to do video or phone brings up feelings he has about his mom, of feeling like a burden. And we were able to slow down and find we're having this experience about us on the surface, but it's hitting him in this really deep child place. So that happens to us a lot, and until we check in with those parts, we don't always know what's happening. So part of the work is it's about listening to those and noticing when are you reacting from your kid self. And then when you're trying to do the proactive work where you're like setting up a feeling session and trying to drop into that feeling, sometimes that conversing or thinking about it as little you can just create a little more compassion. That's the real reason to do that in the proactive work. It's usually a step toward trying to feel it as the part itself. If you're already like, let's say you've done this work for a long time and you something's hard for you and you have access to feeling the pain from the point of view of the pain, you don't need to add the step where you imagine it being something else. Sometimes that's just helpful sometimes. Okay, so that's one thing. There's inner child healing. The other question you're asking me about is like talking about trauma. And one of the things I say in my book is that I mostly don't use the word trauma. I use the word wound or core wound specifically. And the reason I'm choosing to use that word, first of all, the meaning of trauma is wound. So it's not so fancy, but trauma is spoken about so pervasively right now. And there are ways that I think people go on autopilot when they hear certain words that become buzzwords. And I'm not in any way saying that there isn't pervasive, problematic trauma that everyone has been through. And some of it is, like you said, the big T is acute, huge trauma. Like what I went through, trying to stop someone from taking his own life, being pulled into that and him still doing it was annihilating, huge T trauma. Spent 30 years feeling it, you know?
Yeah. It's a big
that's the gift of, that's how I'm so helpful. Big T trauma. Lots of people have that. Little T trauma refers more to kind of pervasive, maybe relational, systemic kind of misalignment. You know, one of the ways people talk about trauma is it's less what happens to you, although obviously what happens matters. It's more, do you have the support and connection to process what happens to you? So if someone had a hard experience, maybe they lost a friend or they had a death or they got very sick or they were in an accident, but there was a ton of support and there was a lot of people sitting with them as they, you know, felt their feelings and they worked through it. They may not hold that as a trauma. It may have been like an acute, painful experience. But so much of when we're thinking of like the little T trauma and the big T trauma is really about how safe do we feel? How held do we feel to actually process through something? So it doesn't mean that everything that's hard that's happened to you is a trauma. And I think part of what's tricky about the word right now is that I think we want to use it about everything. And I just think it's like, you know, there is pain in this life. There is pain in being a human. Even a really, you know, everyone is going to die. We will, everyone we know will. And also we lose jobs, we lose our keys, we don't agree with things that happen politically, we, you know, have feelings, all the things, right? Like, I think that we might eventually scale back from the pervasive use of it in the term of just like describing the pain of being a human.
Yeah.
And, you know, my goal with all of the language I use is try to help people actually have the experience versus have a fancy story about the experience.
Yes. I think it's important also because you changed a lot of words in your perspective. And I think it's healthy to also know that you were talking about trauma is a catchphrase and descriptions on what that knowing emotion that has led to that for you and understanding your definition. Not everybody needs to know about your experiences if you don't feel like sharing, but in that element, you're defining what you truly experience, how to identify it, how to dig deep into it, and how to, you know, classify what you felt in your inner childhood experiences and how that relates to you now and how now you are and how they come up here and there to remind you how far you've come to work on those ideas. So I always ask 2 questions at the end. 1, what is the best advice you've ever received?
Well, you know, when I received it, I was so pissed. It was in the aftermath of first probably week after my first love killed himself. And I was sitting with a teacher in the hallway on the floor because, you know, everyone in our school was impacted. And she said, you know, this too shall pass. And I was like, screw you. But I do think that, you know, the experience of being brave enough to feel is really about learning that it is truly the fastest way through our suffering is to connect to what's happening because, you know, our pain, which is really what most people are afraid of. Of course, we're afraid of like, you know, World War III or acute suffering, but really like it's usually our emotional response to a lot of what happens that is the most overwhelming. Will I be okay? Will anyone love me? Will I be scared? Will I be sad? And when we realize that all of those experiences, if we allow ourselves to know how to have them, are really short-lived, the fastest way to feel better is to learn to feel as bad as you feel. And that's the fastest way to feel better, you know, is just to feel how you feel, you know, it's like, it makes it so that all the things we're so afraid of are less scary. And I do think the wisdom of change that if we can get out of our way when it comes to emotional suffering, it is a very transitory experience that will move. And so that we don't have to, we just have to like figure out how to get out of the way and how to support it moving and then keep going. So I think it's deep wisdom.
Yeah. I mean, you don't think about it in the time. Sometimes you think about the past and you realize what they meant at that moment to kind of get there when you're like, oh, I didn't think about it that way until years later or decades later. And you're like, oh, that had a ring of truth. But also feeling and experiencing your emotions. I always call it my little emotional cleanse of like, I have a crying moment. I'm like, I need to cry right now. Give me about 15 minutes. I'll be good.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Yeah, you're a pro.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, we all have emotions, especially you need to let them out. If you don't, then you're just going to end up being a grumpy, like triggered person for the next week, month, however long it takes you.
Yeah.
So in the process of you've had experiences like this, tried something and maybe failed or tried to explore something that you were unsure of, and what were the prime takeaways from having an experience like that that you learned to develop on? You just touched on one, but one that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, like certainly the medicine that I'm able to share in my life is from having been, annihilated. And so even though it's a convoluted question, would I have wished me to not have that? It was really at this point in my maturity, I can hold that I carry deep fruits. There's deep gifts that I'm now able to be profoundly helpful with. And it was also really a hard path to walk. It was very hard. I wouldn't wish it on little me, but I'm grateful for it. I also think just at a smaller scale, that's really the course of my whole life. Like, this experience that was so big, it set a new trajectory. I don't regret it.
Yeah.
It's like so meaningful to be able to help the other humans with their journey because of that. But I will also say that I've had other failures, like specifically the first time I took my second licensure exam, and I had to take it twice because I failed by a single question. And I had never failed anything academically in my life. And it was deeply unsettling. And I had 1 year before I had to take it again. And I didn't really study until like the last month. And as I started to study, and now all of that information was kind of forgotten, I had this like memory, this experience of seeing the word fail pop up. And it just activated all of my deepest wounds. I wasn't at the place yet where I am now, where I feel like I love myself. I think there were parts of me that are like, am I good enough to be a therapist? Am I going to lose everything? And so while studying for this exam and relearning all this information, which was really hard, I was also like cradling this young injured part of me. And what I will say is that if I would have, which I almost did, passed the first time around, what it would have been is like my egoic arrogance being crowned, ready to be MFT, like, but because I failed and had to bring along this little injured bird part of me that was like, I don't think I can do it. And really like, I mean, I would sit down to study and then be so activated. I would need to like run up a hill for like miles, up the Kensington, where that is. And because I had to do that, when I passed that second time, it was like all of me. Every aspect of me is welcome. Every aspect of me is ready to be a therapist because it wasn't just riding in on my ego or my confidence. And I think that's ultimately what I'm saying to your listeners and to the world is like, we have to pull in these parts of us that have the hard feelings. And that is the way we get to feel like we as a whole being are enough. Yeah. And sometimes we have to fail in order to do that.
True. Testing your wits, and also a prime thing, remaining humble and learning what humble moments are, teaching tools to not let our ego go up too big, and not having our humble moments that we're just person trying to do our best. And it helps to kind of realign your well-being, that you can be humble just because you need it at that point, but you also needed to process way more to get your zone, like your energetic zone, to kind of focus on that and really define your role and your pursuits. I always say that spiritual healers, so to speak, loosely used, have the hard path and never the easy one. So you have to have experiences in order to heal other people, because you have all the deep darknesses that everyone has trespassed over, that you have experienced full awareness and had to process all of that. So a good healer and an amazing pursuit. Rachel, it was a pride to have you today, and I'm excited for your book. You guys go out there and get Feel, Heal, and Let That Shit Go, and check out her podcast, which is available everywhere. Healing Feeling Shit Show, and she's amazing. She's on a plethora of social media, and I hope you reach out to her or buy her book. Thank you very much, Rachel, for your time today.
Yeah, you're welcome. And just the easiest place for people to find all of that is at thefeelingsmovement.com. Everything is there. Thefeelings_movement.com. And thank you for having me on.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com.